I don't care who you are. Get out of that cabin before I call the police. Karen screamed when she saw me lighting a fire on the land I've legally owned since 1987. She thought I was some illegal camper, some vagrant who didn't deserve to set foot in the upscale retreat area of the HOA elite. 10 minutes later, 3 patrol cars screeched to a halt at the forest entrance, sirens wailing, Karen running out, waving her arms like she was flagging down a robbery, pointing straight at me and shouting, "That's him." But then one of the his eyes swept over me for a second. Then he stood at attention, tightened his belt strap, and saluted me with military precision. And at that moment, everything went dead silent, as if the entire forest had just realized she'd made a huge mistake. Comment below where you're watching from, because sometimes the person you think is a nobody turns out to be the one who wrote the rules you're abusing. The October morning mist was clearing from Pine Ridge when I pulled my old Chevy down the dirt road to my grandfather's cabin. After 35 years in the Army, this 40-acre slice of inherited wilderness was my sanctuary. Sarah used to love this place before the cancer took her 2 years ago. We'd sit by the fire pit while she sketched autumn leaves, and I pretended to read. Now I was here alone, needing the peace only these woods could provide. The weathered cedar cabin with its stone chimney represented something money couldn't buy after decades of military service. I was splitting kindling when a pristine BMW X7 cruised down the access road. The driver was a blonde woman in designer sunglasses, phone already out and recording. "Excuse me," she called without leaving her luxury fortress. "This is private. You can't just set up camp wherever you want." Her voice carried that entitled tone I'd encountered before, usually from people who'd never earned anything the hard way. The red recording dot meant she was live streaming this encounter. "I'm going live to document this trespassing situation. We've had problems with homeless people trying to camp in our exclusive community." I set down my axe and approached slowly. Hands visible. Military training taught me de-escalation, though her theatrical performance suggested she wasn't interested in reasonable conversation. "Ma'am, I think there's confusion here. I'm James Morrison, and this is my property. I have the did if you'd like to see it." I reached for my wallet deliberately since she was recording a viewer thing and probably hoping I'd do something that would make good social media content. "I don't care what fake documents you think you have," she snapped, not looking at the paperwork. "I'm Margaret Wellington, president of Pine Estates HOA. And I know every property owner here. You're not one of them." She held her phone higher, capturing my face. "I'm also known as Iron Karen to my followers, and I'm exposing another case of illegal camping in our pristine community. This man is trying to set up a homeless encampment in private land." The irony wasn't lost on me that she called herself Iron Karen while accusing me of being the problem. I'd seen her type before, people who turned neighborhood watch into personal crusades and social media into reality shows. "Mrs. Wellington, I understand your concern, but I am the legal owner. My grandfather, Joseph Morrison, left this to me in 1987. Perhaps you could look at the deed." I held out the documents again, but she was too busy performing on her phone. "Nice try with fake papers," she said, zooming in on me. "This entire area has been under HOA jurisdiction for over 20 years. Whatever scam you're running ends. Now I'm calling the police." She was already dialing 911, switching into victim mode. "Yes, I need police at Pine Ridge Forest Road immediately. A vagrant is threatening me and trying to set up an illegal campsite. He's got some kind of weapon and is being very aggressive and intimidating." I listened to her fabricate a threatening situation from our polite conversation. The woman had decided I was guilty and was determined to create content regardless of the truth. "Ma'am, I haven't threatened you. I've been respectful and tried to show legal documentation," I said clearly for her phone to record. "If this became," she said, "wanted facts on record." "Don't gaslight me," she shrieked, having learned that term from social media. "I know what you're doing. You people think you can move into decent neighborhoods and take over. Not on my watch." The phrase, "you people," hung with ugly implications. This woman had made assumptions based on my workload and old truck that went beyond property disputes. Her live stream gained viewers rapidly, heart reactions and comments popping up faster than she could read. I caught glimpses of messages, some supporting her brave stand against vagrant invasion, while others questioned her version. "Police are on their way," she announced triumphantly, "and we'll see who belongs in this community." She revved her BMW, unnecessarily, as if German engineering would validate her authority over the 40 acres my family had owned since before she'd heard of Pine Ridge. I walked back to the cabin steps, setting Sarah's photograph on the wooden rail. I whispered in Vietnamese learned during my first deployment. Sarah would have handled this with grace and probably had Margaret Wellington apologizing within minutes. But Sarah wasn't here, and I was left dealing with whatever was coming down that road. 3 police cruisers rounded the bend with flashing lights and wailing sirens, creating enough drama to satisfy any influencer's viral dreams. I set Sarah's picture down carefully and stood to face whatever Iron Karen had set in motion, knowing the next few minutes would determine whether I'd get a peaceful weekend in the place my wife had loved most. What Iron Karen didn't know was The old jacket I was wearing had one small detail that only people in the service would recognize. The faded silver star insignia on my collar wasn't some military surplus store decoration. It was the real deal, earned through 3 decades of blood, sweat, and sleepless nights in places most Americans couldn't pronounce. And when the right person spotted it, everything was about to change in ways that Margaret Wellington's social media strategy had never accounted for. 3 police cruisers pulled up with enough and fare to make Karen's livestream dreams come true. She practically sprinted from her BMW toward the lead car, phone held high like she was directing a movie scene. "Officers, thank God you're here. This vagrant has been threatening me and refusing to leave private property. He claims to own this land, but that's impossible." She gestured dramatically toward me, playing up the victim role for her growing online audience. The comments were flying across her screen faster than she could read them, a mix of support and skepticism that she was too focused on her performance to notice. The first officer out was a Hispanic man in his early 40s, and I immediately noticed something about the way he carried himself. There was a slight stiffness to his left leg, the kind you develop when you're compensating for an injury that never quite healed right. Military bearing was unmistakable once you'd seen enough of it, and this man had it in spades. His nameplate, Reed Rodriguez, and when his eyes swept over me, they lingered for just a moment on my collar before his entire posture changed. "Ma'am, if you could step back, please," Rodriguez said to Karen, his voice professional but firm. "Let us assess the situation." He approached me slowly, his gaze now fixed on the insignia that Karen had dismissed us. When he got close enough to confirm what he was seeing, something remarkable happened. This seasoned police officer, this man who probably dealt with difficult people every single day, suddenly snapped to attention with kind of precision you only see in military ceremonies. Major General Morrison Rodriguez's voice cracked as lightly as he rendered a perfect salute, his right hand sharp against his forehead, his left leg trembling slightly with the effort of standing perfectly straight. The forest went dead quiet, except for the sound of Karen's live stream continuing to record what was rapidly becoming a very different story than she'd planned to tell. "Sir, it's an honor. I'm Sergeant Rodriguez, formerly of the 3rd Infantry Division." Karen's phone nearly slipped from her hands. The confident smirk she'd been wearing for her audience melted into confusion, then shock, then something that looked suspiciously like panic. Her viewers were exploding with questions and reactions, the comment feed becoming a waterfall of "wait, what?" and "oh snap," and Karen's about to get schooled. She tried to maintain her composure, but you could see the wheels turning as she realized her vagrant wore some kind of military officer. "Rodriguez," I said, returning his salute before extending my hand. "At ease, son. It's good to see you." The name had clicked the moment he'd identified his unit. 3rd Infantry, Afghanistan, 2018. 2018. You were the sergeant who got hit by that IED outside Kandahar. The memory came flooding back, that terrible day when his Humvee hit a roadside bomb and his left leg got mangled so badly that we thought we'd lose him. "How's the leg holding up?" "Better every day, thanks to you, sir," Rodriguez replied, his voice thick with emotion. The other officers had gotten out of their cars by now and were watching this exchange with growing understanding. "You carried me 3 clicks back to the FOB when the medevac couldn't land," Doc said. "Another hour and I would have bled out." He turned toward Karen and the temperature in his voice dropped about 40. "Ma'am, do you have any documentation proving your authority over this property?" Karen's livestream was now completely out of her control. What had started as Brevesitizen confronts dangerous vagrant had turned into Karen Harris's decorated military hero, and her comments section was reflecting that shift in real time. I'm the HOA president," she stammered, suddenly realizing that her usual tactics weren't going to work against facts. "This entire area falls under our jurisdiction. He can't just squat here illegally." "Ma'am, I'm going to need to see some documentation of your claims," Rodriguez said, his tone now purely professional, "because what I'm seeing here is a property owner on Hisland being harassed by someone with a cell phone." He gestured toward me. "General Morrison, do you have your property documentation available?" I pulled out the deed and survey maps, the same documents that Karen had refused to look at during her dramatic performance. Rodriguez examined them carefully, his trained eye picking up details that Karen's entitled assumptions had missed. "Property purchased in 1987, taxes, current survey boundaries marked, sir. This appears to be completely legitimate." Karen's face was cycling through several shades of red as she realized her social media victory was turning into a very public humiliation. Her livestream viewers were now pushing the hashtag #KarenVsGeneral, and based on the comments, you could see over her shoulder, public opinion was not swinging in her direction. "This is ridiculous. I know every property owner in Pine Ridge Estates. He's lying about something, ma'am," Rodriguez said, his patience wearing thin. "I'm going to ask you one more time for documentation supporting your claims. If you can't provide a legal basis for your authority over this property, then you're the one who's trespassing." The other officers were nodding in agreement, and I could see Karen's confident facade. finally beginning to crack under the weight of factual law enforcement scrutiny. Rodriguez turned back to me with something that looked like relief mixed with respect. "Sir, I apologize for any inconvenience this situation has caused. Is there anything else you need from us today?" But Karen wasn't finished with her performance yet, and I had a feeling this confrontation was just getting started. Karen thought that hiring an $800 per hour lawyer would handle this problem. She had no idea that the man she was up against had authored the military manual on land rights disputes and had spent more time in legal briefings than she'd spent watching reality television. But Margaret Wellington was about to learn that when you mess with someone who understands both the law and human nature, you better come prepared for a fight that goes way beyond social media theatrics. Within 24 hours of her humiliating live-stream defeat, Karen had mobilized what she probably thought was an impressive legal arsenal. Her attorney, Harrison Blake, from the prestigious firm of Blake, Sterling and Associates, showed up at my cabin the next morning in a Mercedes that cost more than most people's houses. It was everything you'd expect from an expensive lawyer: a perfectly tailored suit, a briefcase that probably had its insurance policy, and that particular brand of arrogance that comes from never having to face real consequences for being wrong. "Mr. Morrison," Blake announced, not bothering with pleasantries, "my client, Mrs. Wellington, has retained me to resolve this property dispute. We have reason to believe you're occupying this land illegally, and we're prepared to pursue all available legal remedies." He handed me a thick envelope with the kind of flourish that suggested he thought legal documents were somehow intimidating to someone who'd spent decades dealing with military bureaucracy. "That's a cease and desist order requiring you to vacate these premises within 72 hours. I opened the envelope and scanned the documents, noting several interesting details that Mr. Blake had missed in his rush to intimidate me. "This is fascinating," I said, looking up at him with what I hoped was an appropriately impressed expression. "Tell me, did you research property boundaries before filing this, or were you just taking your client's word for everything?" The document claimed I was squatting on HOA common land, which would have been compelling if it weren't complete nonsense. "Mrs. Wellington has been the HOA president for over a decade," Blake replied stiffly. "She knows every inch of this community." Behind him, I could see Karen sitting in her BMW, probably live-streaming this encounter as part 2 of her legal drama series. "Your alligator ownership documents are outdated and superseded by the community development agreements established in 2003. "Interesting theory," I said, pulling out my documentation. "However, you might want to check the county My deed predates your HOA by 15 years, and there's something called grandfathered rights that your law school probably covered in Property Law 101. I handed him my survey maps and deed copy. "You'll also notice that my property taxes have been current every year since 1987, which tends to establish a pretty clear chain of..." Blake's confident expression wavered as he read my documents for the first time. I could practically see him calculating how much research his firm should have done before taking Karen's money and making threats they couldn't back up. "We'll need to verify these documents," he said, his voice losing some of its courtroom authority. "There may be zoning issues or environmental restrictions that supersede individual ownership rights." "You're right to be thorough," I agreed pleasantly. "While you're doing that research, you might want to look into Mrs. Wellington's authority to make representations about property that she doesn't own. There are some interesting laws about filing falsy documents and making fraudulent claims. I'd seen enough legal intimidation tactics in the military to recognize Matira when it walked up to my door. Karen must have gotten tired of watching from her car because she suddenly appeared beside her lawyer, phone already recording. He's stalling and trying to confuse the legal issues. She announced to her audience, "Mr. Blake just explained to him that we have community standards and he can't just ignore them." She was trying to regain control of the narrative, but there was something desperate in her voice that suggested yesterday's public humiliation was still stinging. "Mrs. Wellington," Blake said carefully, "perhaps we should continue this discussion in private." He was realizing that his client's social media strategy and legal strategy were working at cross purposes. Nothing kills a strong legal position faster than having your client live stream herself, making claims that aren't supported by facts. But Karen was too invested in her performance to take the hint. "I've been protecting this community from undesirable elements for years," she continued, apparently forgetting Thatch was talking about a decorated military officer. "We have standards here, and we can't just let anyone move in and lower our property values." The classist undertones that had been simmering beneath the surface were now becoming explicit. That evening I received an email that was meant to intimidate me into leaving quietly. It claimed to be from the law offices of Harrison Blake and threatened criminal prosecution for trespassing, vandalism, and threatening behavior toward community residents. The problem was real lawyers don't usually send threatening emails from Gmail accounts, and the legal terminology was just wrong enough to suggest someone had been copying and pasting from legal websites without really understanding what they were reading. I forwarded the email to my son, Michael, who happened to be a partner at a real law firm in Washington, D.C. His response came back within an hour. "Dad, this is either a fake lawyer or the worst real lawyer in Virginia. Also, why didn't you tell May you were having property issues?" I'd been hoping for an excuse to come visit. Sometimes the best weapon against legal intimidation is actual legal knowledge, and Karen had just picked a fight with someone whose family happened to include the actual attorneys. The next morning brought another surprise. A county inspector showed up claiming there were irregularities with my building permits that required immediate attention. When I asked who had filed the complaint, I mentioned that it came from concerned community members but couldn't provide specifics. It was becoming clear that Karen was working multiple angles using her HOA connections to create bureaucratic pressure where legal intimidation had failed. But Mrs. Wellington didn't know that attacking a retired major general meant she'd just declared war on someone who understood strategy, logistics, and the value of having good intelligence about your opponent's weaknesses. When the words Major General Morrison being harassed appeared on the Veterans Brotherhood Facebook group, an entire legion woke up. Karen had no idea that targeting a retired general wasn't just picking on one old man in the woods. She was about to discover that the military creates bonds that don't break. When you hang up the uniform in some fights, you just can't win with lawyers and live streamed. You're facing people who've learned teamwork under actual fire. The first sign that something had shifted came at dawn on Thursday morning. I was making coffee when I heard the rumble of motorcycle engines coming down Theforest Road. Not just one or two bikes, but what sounded like a convoy. By the time I stepped outside, 12 Harley Davidsons were pulling into my clearing. Riders wearing leather vests covered in military patches. Leading the group was Tommy Tank Martinez, a master sergeant I'd served with in Iraq, grinning like we'd just pulled off a successful mission. "Morning, General," Tank called out, dismounting his bike with the fluid motion of someone who'd been riding longer than he'd been walking. "Heard you were having some trouble with the local homeowners association. Thought you might need some community support." Behind him, the other riders were setting up folding chairs and a camping table like they'd in this operation 1,000 times before. "Hope you don't mind, but word gets around in the veteran community one of our own gets hassled." Within an hour, my quiet forest retreat had transformed into something that looked like a military reunion crossed with a camping festival. More vehicles kept arriving. Not just motorcycles, but pickup trucks, RVs and cars with veteran license plates from 3 different states. Each new arrival brought stories about how they'd heard about my situation through the veteran network that operates faster and more efficiently than any social media algorithm. The irony wasn't lost on me that Karen's attempts to use so against me had backfired spectacularly. Her original live stream had been shared in veteran groups with commentary that was decidedly unsympathetic to her cause. Screenshots of her calling me a vagrant and demanding I produce identification were generating the kind of outrage that people feel when they see so many respecting their family, because that's what military service creates. A family that extends far beyond blood. "Sir, you might want to see this," said Maria Santos, a former Army communications specialist, who'd set up what appeared to be a mobile command center complete with laptops and satellite internet. "Your HOA president is having a very bad week online." She turned her screen toward me, showing Karen's social media accounts. Her follower count was dropping by the hundreds, and the comments on her recent posts were overwhelmingly negative. Number I and Karen V's general waste trending, but not in the way she'd hoped. The real shift in momentum came when Michael's car pulled up around noon. I hadn't seen my son in over a year. Our relationship strained by decades of military deployments that had prioritized duty over family dinners. But there he was, stepping out of his BMW, his expansive DC lawyer suit, looking around at the organized chaos of veterans setting up camp in support of his father. "Dad," he said, and for a moment we just stood there awkwardly. Then Tank whistled sharply and called out attention. Every veteran in the clearing immediately stopped what they were doing and snapped to attention, facing Michael and me. The silence was profound, broken only by the sound of wind through the trees. "Sir," Tank said formally, "your son has arrived." It was a gesture of respect that military families understand, acknowledging both the sacrifice of service and the cost it extracts from the people who love soldiers. Michael's composure cracked slightly. "Jesus, Dad, you never told me about this." He gestured at the assembled group of people who dropped everything to support someone they considered family. "I mean, I knew you were respected." But his voice trailed off as he realized that his father's military service had created connections that went far beyond anything his law firm could understand. "Son," I said quietly, "there are some things that can't be explained, only experienced. These people understand loyalty in ways that most civilians never will." I put my hand on his shoulder, feeling some of the distance that had grown between us. Close. Your mother always said that military families serve, too, even when they don't wear the uniform. The afternoon brought news that Karen's support within the HOA was crumbling. Mrs. Chen, an elderly board member who'd always been intimidated by Karen's aggressive leadership style, had called to apologize for the harassment and to inform me that several HOA members were demanding an emergency meeting to discuss Karen's conduct. Attacking a decorated veteran wasn't the kind of community leadership that everyone could support. But the most significant of all came when Tank approached me with a serious expression. "General, you need to know something." A few of the guys Did some reconnaissance on your HOA president. He handed me a folder. Turns out Mrs. Wellington has been creative with the community funds, property management contracts that happen to go to companies she has financial interests in, and maintenance fees that seem high compared to the actual work performed. Nothing that would normally get investigated unless someone knew where to look. I opened the folder and scanned the financial documents that Tank's reconnaissance had uncovered. It wasn't evidence of massive fraud, but it was definitely evidence. Officer Mayen who'd been using their position for personal benefit. Thanks. How exactly did you get these documents? Let's just say that one of our guys works in county administration and has access to public records. Tank replied with the kind of innocent expression that suggested there was more to the story. Amazing what you can find when you know how to ask the right questions in the right offices. Karen Wellington had started this fight, thinking she was dealing with one isolated old man who could be intimidated into leaving quietly. She was about to discover Thatched picked a battle with a community that understood both loyalty and justice, and that some wars can't be won with lawyers and social media when your opponents know how to conduct actual intelligence operations. When Karen realized she couldn't win with law or public opinion, she decided to stop playing by any rules at all. She was going to attack the one thing she thought would destroy me completely, my military service record, turning thievery thing that had earned respect into a weapon against me. But Margaret Wellington was about to learn that when you try to destroy someone's honor, you better make sure you understand exactly who you're dealing with and what kind. O'Fahleys they've made over 3 decades of service. The attack came from multiple directions simultaneously, coordinated with the kind of precision that Karen probably thought made her a strategic genius. First, a story appeared in the Pine community newsletter suggesting that I might be suffering from combat-related psychological issues that made me a potential danger to the community. The article didn't name me directly, but their references to unstable veterans and PTSD episodes were aimed at undermining the respect that Rodriguez's salute had generated. The same day, Karen hired Thompson Investigative Services, a private detective firm that specialized in what their website euphemistically called background verification for community safety. Their job was to dig through my military record, looking for anything that could be twisted into evidence that I was unfit to live among decent people. Karen was betting that 35 years of military service would include something, anything that could be taken out of context and used to paint me as dangerous. What she didn't know was that Marcus Webb, the investigator she'd hired, was a former military intelligence officer who'd worked with my unit during 2 separate deployments. Marcus had been the one who'd helped us identify IED networks in Afghanistan, and his work had saved more American lives than Karen could count. When he received her contract and realized who his target was supposed to be, Marcus made a decision that demonstrated the difference between loyalty that's bought and loyalty that's earned. General Morrison Marcus said when he called me that evening, "I thought you should know that Mrs. Wellington has hired me to investigate your military service record. She's looking for anything that might suggest you're psychologically intense or have a history of violence." His voice carried the kind of controlled anger that comes from watching Suminayat, a person you respect. She specifically asked me to focus on any incidents involving civilian casualties or disciplinary actions. I wasn't surprised by tactics, but I was impressed by her completionist of how military intelligence networks function. "Marcus, I appreciate the heads up. What did y'all tell her?" The irony of hiring a former intelligence officer to investigate someone he'd worked with wasn't lost on either of us. I told her that thorough investigations take time and that she should expect my preliminary report in 2 weeks. Marcus replied, "What I didn't tell her is that my report is going to be very thorough indeed, including documentation of her request to fabricate evidence if I couldn't find any real problems." The satisfaction in her voice suggested that Karen had just handed him everything he needed to destroy her credibility permanently. But Karen's nuclear option was still building momentum. She'd managed to get a local television reporter interested in a story about veteran mental health and community safety, obviously hoping to generate negative coverage that would force me to leave quietly. The reporter, Jennifer Walsh from Channel 7 News, had been fed a story about how HOAs needed to be more careful about who they allowed into their communities, with obvious implications about my presidency. Pine Ridge, the interview, was scheduled for Friday afternoon, and I could see Karen's plan. She would present herself as a concerned community leader trying to balance compassion for veterans with safety for families, while subtly suggesting that my presence represented a risk that responsible people couldn't ignore. It was character assassination disguised as civic responsibility. Then at 3 o'clock in the morning on Thursday, everything changed in a way that Karen hadn't planned and couldn't control. I woke up to the smell of smoke and the sound of tanks shouting from outside my cabin. The old electrical system that I'd been meaning to upgrade had finally given up, and flames were already consuming the kitchen and spreading toward the living room, where Sarah's photographs and our 30 years of memories were stored. The volunteer fire department arrived within 15 minutes, but it was too late to salvage the cabin. Tank and several other veterans had managed to get me out safely, but everything inside was lost. Standing in my boxer shorts and a borrowed jacket, watching 3 decades of memories turn to ash, I felt something break inside me that had nothing to do with property damage. Sarah's sketches, our wedding photos, the letters she'd written during my deployments, all of it was gone. But as the fire crew worked to contain the blaze, they discovered something that my grandfather had hidden 70 years ago. The stone foundation of the cabin had been built around a small underground storage area, a root cellar that had been converted into a fireproof safe room. Inside that hidden space was a metal strongbox that had survived not just the fire, but decades of weather, and when we opened the box the next morning, what we found changed everything. My grandfather's real will, not the simplified version that had been filed with the county, along with original survey maps and land purchase documents dating back to 1925, but more importantly, there were detailed records of every transaction involving the Pine Ridge area, including documentation that proved the HOA's property claims were based on forged documents filed in 1994. Karen had hired a private investigator to dig up dirt on my past, not knowing that the investigator was already on my side. She tried to destroy my reputation with Lisa Bott's mental instability, not realizing that her financial crimes were already being documented, and now, thanks to a fire that she hadn't caused, but that had revealed evidence she'd spent decades trying to hide, Margaret Wellington was about to discover that some battles can't be won when the truth finally comes to light. David, you need to call your mother, I thought, remembering the hint she'd dropped about needing her son's help because Karen was going to need a good lawyer, and not second. She'd been hiring to intimidate her neighbors. What my grandfather had hidden in that fireproof strongbox wasn't just a will. It was evidence of a fraud that had been running for 30 years. The documents proved that Margaret Wellington hadn't just been lying about my property rights. She'd been running a sophisticated scam that had stolen land from multiple families and funneled hundreds of thousands of dollars into her accounts. But more importantly, these papers were going to give me the platform to end this war in the most public way possible. The real estate documents in my grandfather's strongbox told a story that Karen had spent decades trying to bury. In 1925, my great-grandfather had purchased not just 40 acres where my cabin stood, but an additional 260 acres that encompassed most of what was now Pine Ridge Estates. The HOA development had been built on land that legally belonged to my family using forged transfer documents that dated back to 1994, right around the time Karen had first gotten involved in community leadership. Michael spent Thursday morning at the county recorder's office, cross-referencing the documents we'd found with official records. What he discovered was even more damaging than we'd initially realized. Dad, this isn't just about your property, he said, spreading copies across the makeshift table that Tank had set up in the clearing where my cabin used to stand. Karen has been systematically filing false ownership claims and collecting HOA fees on land that was never legally part of the development. The financial records were equally devastating. For over 20 years, Karen had been collecting monthly HOA fees from residents who thought they were paying for community maintenance, and instead, much of that money had been diverted into accounts controlled by companies that existed only on paper. Companies that happened to be owned by Margaret Wellington's various business entities. Landscaping contracts, security services, and property management fees had all been inflated and redirected to benefit Karen personally. But the most damning evidence was a series of recorded phone calls that my grandfather had made in 1994 when he'd first discovered what Karen was planning. Grandpa Joe had been old school suspicious of anyone trying to change property boundaries, and he documented every conversation he'd had with county officials, lawyers, and Karen herself. The recordings made it clear that Karen had known from the beginning that she was stealing land and that she'd planned to wait until my grandfather died before implementing her scheme. General, you need to see this, said Maria Santos, looking up from her laptop with an expression of barely contained outrage. Mrs. Wellington's social media accounts from 2019 show her bragging about acquiring additional community assets through strategic negotiation. She's been treating this like a business accomplishment. The screenshots showed Karen posting about her success in expanding HOA authority and protecting property values through decisive leadership. By Friday afternoon, I'd made a decision that would have made my grandfather proud. Instead of handling this quietly through lawyers and backroom negotiations, I was going to give Margaret Wellington's public accountability she'd been so eager to create with her live streams. I called Jennifer Walsh at Channel 7 News and told her that I had information about HOA fraud that would make her veteran mental health story look like small-town gossip. The press conference was scheduled for Saturday morning in the clearing where my cabin had been. Word spread through the veteran community and social media faster than wildfire, and by 9 a.m. we had news crews from 3 different stations, a reporter from the regional newspaper, and about 200 people who'd come to witness what Tank was calling the reckoning. Karen arrived in her BMW right on schedule, apparently thinking she was going to continue her campaign of character assassination in front of the cameras. She had her phone out and was already live streaming her approach to what she thought would be my final humiliation. I'm here to provide context for whatever lies this unstable veteran is planning to tell, she announced to her remaining followers. The community needs to hear the truth about what happened here. What happened next was the kind of public devastation that social media was designed to capture and preserve forever. With news cameras rolling and Karen's live stream broadcasting to her followers, I methodically presented every piece of evidence. We'd uncovered the forget property transfers, the diverted HOA funds, the recorded conversations from 1994, and the business records showing how Karen had been stealing from her neighbors for decades. Mrs. Wellington, I said, looking directly at her as she stood frozen beside her car. You called me a vagrant and demanded that I prove my right to exist in this community. Well, here's my proof. I held up the original deed and survey maps. This entire development was built on land that my family has owned since 1925. Every fee you've collected, every assessment you've levied, every family you've intimidated into selling their homes. It was all based on a lie. Karen's livestream captured her complete breakdown in real time. The confident community leader persona crumbled as she realized that her 30-year scam was being exposed to news cameras and broadcast live to anyone still following her social media accounts. You can't prove any of this, she stammered, but her voice lacked conviction because she could see the documents and recordings that proved everything. Mrs. Wellington, we can prove all of it, Michael said, stepping forward with a folder thick with legal papers. We've already filed complaints with the district attorney's office, the state real estate commission, and the IRS. Your little empire is over. Delaware and him was enjoying the complete reversal of leverage that had taken place since Wednesday morning. But the moment that broke Karen completely came when Mrs. Chen, the elderly HOA board member who'd been intimidated by Karen for years, stepped in front of the cameras. She told my family we did do to belong in this community, Mrs. Chen said quietly. She said people like us brought down property values and that we should sell our house before she found legal ways to force us out. I have the recording of that conversation on my phone as Karen's world collapsed around her in front of rolling cameras and live streaming phones. Her last desperate act was to pull out her cell phone and make a call. Not to her lawyer, not to her servitors, but to someone she'd mentioned briefly during her previous rants about family loyalty. David shouted into the phone, her voice breaking. I need you to come home. I need my son to help me. The desperation in her voice was painful to hear, even for someone who'd spent the week trying to destroy my life and reputation. Margaret Wellington had spent 30 years building an empire based on lies, intimidation, and stolen money. In the span of one press conference, that empire had become a pile of legal documents that would probably send her to prison. But her final phone call suggested that the real reckoning was still coming, and it would involve the one person whose opinion she cared about. Karen's final phone call wasn't to a lawyer or a political contact who might help her escape the consequences of 30 years of fraud. She called her son, Special Agent David Wellington of the FBI, the one person whose respect she'd been trying to earn her entire adult life. But what Margaret Wellington was about to discover was that the child she'd raised to believe in justice and integrity had grown into a man who wouldn't compromise those values, even for the woman who'd given him life. David arrived at Pine Ridge on Sunday morning, driving a governmentist sedan that looked deliberately understated compared to his luxury BMW. He was younger than I'd expected, maybe 35, with the kind of controlled bearing that comes from years of federal law enforcement training. When he got out of his car and surveyed scene, the assembled news crews, the veteran supporters, and the evidence-satables that Michael had organized, his expression suggested he'd already figured out how this story was going toned. Mom, he said quietly, approaching Karen, who was sitting in her car with the windows up, apparently hoping the whole situation would disappear if she ignored it long enough. We need to talk. His voice carried the weight of someone who'd spent years investigating financial crimes and could recognize a catastrophic legal situation when he said, and you need to turn off that live stream right now. Karen's face when she realized her son had arrived was a mixture of relief and terror. She'd been counting on David to somehow use his federal connections to make her problems disappear, but the look on his face suggested that wasn't going to happen. David, thank God you're here, she said, getting out of her car with the kind of forced enthusiasm that desperate people use when they're trying to convince themselves that everything is fine. These people are trying to destroy everything I've built. They're using fake documents and fabricated evidence. Mom, stop talking, David said firmly. Just stop. He pulled out his badge and walked over to where I was standing with Michael and Tanks. Sir, I'm Special Agent Wellington, FBI Financial Crimes Division. I need to apologize for my mother's behavior, and I need you to know that anything she's done here has nothing to do with federal law enforcement. The professional distance in his voice made it clear that he was speaking as an FBI agent, not as Karen's son. What happened next was perhaps the most devastating revelation of the entire week. David explained that he'd been investigating Pine Ridge Estates HOA for over 6 months, as part of a broader inquiry into municipal corruption and property fraud in Virginia. When reports started coming in about unusual property transfers and financial irregularities, you're flagged for investigation, he told the assembled crowd. What I didn't know until yesterday was that my mother was the primary suspect. Karen's reaction to learning that her son had been investigating her crimes was complete emotional collapse. The woman who'd spent the week trying to destroy my reputation and force me from my property suddenly became a broken person who could barely stand upright. "David, you don't understand," she sobbed. "I was trying to build something important. I was trying to create value for the community." "Mom, you stole nearly $400,000 from your neighbors over 20 years, David replied, his voice heavy with disappointment that went far beyond professional duty. "You forged legal documents, filed false property claims, and intimidated elderly residents into selling their homes for below market value. That's not community building, that's organized crime." The precision with which he outlined her offenses suggested that the FBI investigation was much more complete than any of us had realized. The federal charges that David outlined were extensive enough to put Karen in prison for the rest of her life. Wire fraud, mail fraud, conspiracy to commit real estate fraud, money laundering, and violation of civil rights under color of local authority. But what broke my heart watching this family destruction play out in front of news cameras was seeing a son who dedicated his life to justice having tortured his mother. But the story wasn't over yet. In a moment that surprised everyone, including David, I stepped forward and addressed the cameras directly. "I want to make something clear," I said, looking at the reporters and the crowd of supporters who'd gathered to witness Karen's downfall. "Mrs. Wellington committed serious crimes and needs to face the consequences. But this community also needs healing, not just punishment." What I announced next was something I'd been thinking about since Thursday night when the fire had destroyed my cabin. Revealed the truth about the land. I'm donating 200 acres of this property to the county for a public park and campground. It will be free for veterans and their families, and it will include facilities for community events that bring people together instead of driving them apart. The idea had been Sarah's originally, something she'd mentioned years ago about wanting to share the beauty of these woods with people who needed peace. The offer of redemption that followed was perhaps the most important part of the whole story. Instead of simply watching Karen go to prison, David proposed that she serve her sentence through community service and restitution, working at a center that helped people deal with the kind of control issues and fear of abandonment that had driven her criminal behavior. "My mother needs to understand how her actions affected real people," he said, "and maybe helping others will help her find a way to live with what she's done." Karen's acceptance of responsibility came through tears and genuine remorse that seemed to surprise everyone, including herself. "I lost my husband because I couldn't stop trying to control everything," she said quietly. "I lost my son's respect because I thought power was more important than integrity. I don't want to lose the chance to become someone better than the person I've been." It was the first honest thing she'd said since this whole confrontation began. 6 months later, Pine Ridge Estates had been reorganized with transparent financial management and community input on all major decisions. The Veterans Campground was hosting its first family weekend, with Karen volunteering to help coordinate activities as part of her coordinated community service. David visited regularly, working to rebuild a relationship with his mother based on honesty instead of manipulation. I was sitting by the fire pit where my new cabin was taking shape, watching Mikkel teach his daughter how to skip stones on the creek that ran through our family's land. Tank was grilling hamburgers for a dozen veterans and their families who'd but become weekend regulars, and Mrs. Chen was showing Sarah's sketches to anyone who wanted to hear stories about the woman who'd loved this place before any of us understood its true value. Sometimes the greatest victory isn't defeating your enemy. It's helping them find their way home to the person they were meant to be all along. Sometimes the people who hurt us most are fighting battles we can't see. Karen's story reminds us that beneath anger and control often lies fear and pain that needs healing, not just punishment. True strength isn't about winning fights, it's about creating space for every net to become better than they were yesterday. Have you ever experienced a conflict that changed your perspective and forgiveness? Share your story in the comments below. If this touched your heart, please like and subscribe.